M squared here, and today we are going to talk about factoring by grouping using the grouping method. So remember, it doesn't matter what method of factoring you're using when you're factoring quadratic trinomials, you always want to make sure that you look for a greatest common factor first. So I see in number 1 that every term is even, which means that my greatest common factor is 2 at least. So I say, I know that 6 is 2 times 3. So I know that 2 times 13 is 26. So it looks like 2 is going to be the only possible greatest common factor. So I'm going to factor out a 2. So I just divide every term by 2 to see what's left after I factor out a 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, 6x squared would be 3x squared. 26 divided by 2 gets me 13, and 28 divided by 2 gets me 14. So I now know that my final answer is going to be 2 binomials multiplied together with a 2 out front, because I have to save that 2. But for now, for the rest of the factoring, I'm only going to use this trinomial right here. So I'm going to take 3 times 14, 3x squared times 14, that's 42, x squared, and I'm going to put that in my little t-chart because I'm going to try to find 2 factors of 42x squared that add up to 13x. So if you want to get it right, you just systematically go through, okay, that's 1 times 42, that doesn't work. 2 times, what do we got, 21, that doesn't work. 3 times 14, that doesn't add up to 13. And then we've got 6 times 7, and there's our little gem. So it would be 6x and 7x. Remember, I ignore the x just because I don't want to write it every time, but I need it. So 6x plus 7x does indeed get me 13x, and it also multiplies to 42x squared. So in the grouping method, what I do is I take the ax squared and the 14 and I put them down, but I save room because I'm going to split that 13x into 2 parts, 6x and a 7x, which still equals 13x. I'm just changing a little bit how it looks. And I'm going to put the 6 first because I see the 3 and I see they have a greatest common factor of 3, and I know that the 14 has a greatest common factor of 7. So to me, that just naturally goes that way. If you did it the other way, you could still get the right answer. It just might not be quite as easy to figure out. You wouldn't have maybe as much of a greatest common factor or a different one. But I just like to do it that way. Okay, so grouping method, that's the first step of the grouping method, to find those 2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the greatest common factor out of these 2 and the greatest common factor out of those 2. That's the grouping method. Okay, so the greatest common factor between these 2 is 3x. And so then I divide each of those by 3x. So when I divide this by 3x, I get an x. When I divide this by 3x, I get a 2. Now the greatest common factor between 7x and 14 is 7. So when I divide both of those by 7, I get x plus 2. Notice that the x plus 2 is the same in both pairs. That's important because I need to now notice that that's the greatest common factor, and I'm going to factor it out. So there's one of those, and then what's left is what I have left here, the 3x plus 7. So that is my factoring of this trinomial, which now I put up here. And then I'm going to double check it just to make sure. So does x times 3x really get me 3x squared? Yes. Does 6x plus 7x get me my 13x? And does 2 times 7 get me my 14? Yes, it does. And then if I multiply all those, the 2 by 3, I can see that that's going to be my answer. So this is my final answer. Okay, we'll try one more. All right, so we look for a greatest common factor. There is not one. So I know my final answer is just going to be 2 binomials. So I start my t-chart. I do a times c. And so that is 30x squared. And my b is 11x. So I'm trying to find 2 factors of 30x squared that are going to add up to negative 11. So to add to get a negative, but to multiply to get a positive, that means that both of my factors are going to have to be negative. So again, if you see it, then you can put the factors down. But if you don't see it, remember, we're just going to keep going. -1 times -30, -2 times -15, negative 3 times negative 10, negative 5 times negative 6, and there we go. That's my negative 11. So if I put my x's back, I get negative 11x when I add and positive 30x when I multiply. So I'm going to rewrite my 3x squared and my 10, but instead of the negative 11x, I'm going to put negative 5x and negative 6x. And again, I'm going to put the negative 6x first and the negative 5x last because the 5 and the 10 kind of naturally go together. And the 6 and the 3 do. So then I take the greatest common factor out of each of those pairs, right? So I'm going to do it out of this pair and then out of that pair. And what's in parentheses should be the same. So the greatest common factor here is a 3x. The greatest common factor here, now we've got to be careful because that's a negative, right? When we go through this, when we divide that by 3x, we get an x. When we divide that by 3x, we get a 2, a minus 2. So in order to get that same pairing over here, we're going to have to factor out a negative common factor. So we're going to have to factor out a negative 5 because we want the exact same thing left in parentheses. So when I do that, a negative 5x divided by a negative 5 is an x, and a 10 divided by a negative 5 is a negative 2. It's super important that we have the exact same thing, signs included, inside those parentheses. All right, so now that we have that, we're going to take out that greatest common factor. So that's going to be x minus 2. And then what's left, we put in the second parenthesis. Because if we divided this by x minus 2, we'd get 3x. And if we divided this by x minus 2, we'd get negative 5. And this is my answer. So I get x minus 2 times 3x minus 5. All righty, good luck with that. That's factoring by grouping. M squared, signing out.